Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local. Okay, so that's a perfect segue into our second discussion, which is kind of coming off the Verge article, and the title is escaping me now. Um,
How Google ruined the internet or something?
no, that's the first one. While
It's
I'm
essentially
stalling
the same
for time,
thing.
yeah, it's anyway. Regardless of what the title is, the latest article, which is kind of consistent with the tone and the idea of the previous article, um, is talking about. This is your piece. This is your piece, David.
Sure. So basically
So I don't.
the
You characterize it.
sure, the gist of the article is that Google has created all of these incentives in terms of how pages are structured and how even to the point of I wouldn't say enforcing, but incentivizing the content that is generated based on searcher behavior and some of their page experience updates and all these kinds of things, that they have basically made the entire internet look the same. And that this author is lamenting the fact that I don't know what the problem is, to be honest. I don't think it's a problem, but that somehow content creators on the internet have lost the ability to be creative with their writing, and that everything looks now homogenous because Google's dominant place in the sort of information ecosystem online has sort of created all of these carbon copies. So the examples she gives are things like, and it's a very, I would say it's a very naive and skewed article in terms of some of the comments she makes, but like, well, we have all of these people who are searching for these kinds of terms, so we're going to write articles about the most popular terms in our in our domain, and boom, there's our content strategy. And it's like, that's not actually a content strategy, nor is it a very good SEO strategy. But that's the kind of logic that she's using. And I think she sort of conflates a couple of different things in her sort of thesis. No, the first being a lot of the homogeneity that she laments is actually based on best practices in terms of how users consume information online. So the one of the things that she highlights is, we can't produce these long form content pieces anymore. And if we do, they have to be sort of chunked out by, sections. And we have to have a table of contents at the top that links to the appropriate sections if we want this content to perform well. And I would just say, yeah, if you want that to perform well on Google, that's definitely a best practice. Also, if you want people to actually enjoy reading your content, that's a best practice. We know that people do not read tomes of information online unless they're really, really interested in a particular topic. And so it's actually a best practice to include these sort of section breaks with headlines so that people can skim your content and read just the part that they're interested in reading. So I think that that's a real, sort of major gap in her analysis. The second thing I would say is the internet has definitely changed since, 10 or 15 years ago, probably when she sort of remembers, being able to browse all of these sort of, hole in the wall kinds of websites. And we now consume so much more information on our phones. Frankly, it's just really, really hard for sort of pages to be structured all that differently when the screen size is so small. And so I think that I don't know. I just didn't understand. I do understand sort of where she's coming from in terms of like seeing this homogeneity, but I don't necessarily blame Google for it. And I don't know what the alternatives would be, given that this form factor, the phone, is the dominant mode of consumption of information.
I read. I mean, I sort of scanned the article and then I read it carefully earlier today, and I'm quite sympathetic to a lot of the things she says. I don't disagree with your point, David, that a lot of what she's describing could be flipped around and talked about in terms of best practices, user behavior best practices, and the way that people consume content. I also there was also a point made about how she was talking about bloggers in this particular case, but how people have to really target very long tail keywords because they can't compete, for head terms or popular keywords. And that this was skewing content also, that the way in which they needed to generate headlines, and they needed to create content that yes served users, but also um, I'm not going to articulate it correctly. There was a way in which this Google was helping to flatten the internet, homogenize the internet, and also um, distorting what people might create content about. So it was like, my impression was, instead of writing things that you want to write, you're writing things that you think Google wants you to write for its users. And
But guess what? Those users are searching for those answers to those
right.
questions. So it's like, oh, I only want to create content that I'm interested in. I don't care what my audience is interested in, which seems just like a really bad content strategy
Well,
for someone who is in the content business.
right. I think the answer is, it depends, on what you're doing, and what your industry or vertical or what your business model is. But um,
But I think that's, I
she
mean, to me, Greg, you hit the nail on the head with by bringing up business model, right? I mean, if these people want to have hobby blogs where they're just writing about what they want to write about, that's great. If you are operating a business, which a lot of, I don't, content creators, whatever that term is, actually are now operating businesses. There's all this, TikTok uh,
yeah.
sort of arc of content creators actually making money doing this. Guess what? You have to produce content that performs well with your audience if you want this to be a business. This is not a, if you want it to be a hobby, there's nothing Google is doing preventing you from writing articles that are as long as you want without any headlines about topics that only you care about and no one on the internet does. Like, that's all totally fair game. But if you want to have a real business built around an audience, guess what? You kind of do need to produce content your audience is interested in.
That's a
David,
very fair point. Go
it is
ahead.
a fair point, but I would like to point out that the algorithm does tend to distort human reality. And an example of this is one of the videos I did for my LSA scam. I took the transcript to ChatGPT. I said, write me an optimized title for YouTube and an optimized description to get maximum exposure for this video. And so it came up with something like exposed the shocking Google LSA duck cleaning scam, a real victim story, and went on to explain it.
Yep.
That video with that title has gotten 3 times as much viewership as any other video we've done over the last 2.5 years.
Great.
So there, I mean,
But that's not, Mike. Our we don't care if consumers are reading that stuff. We
No, I
we
know,
care
but
that other marketers. And you think other marketers are going to respond to that headline who are sort of in our world? I kind of
I
don't
don't
think so.
know, but I did it as an experiment, and there is a truth to the fact that when there is an algorithm functioning like this, that people play to the algorithm plays to
Sure.
the people. There is a dynamic that tends to reduce this to fairly low common denominators.
But
Well, I mean,
this is a problem of just needing like one. This is a problem of scale in my mind, right? Regardless if it's Google or TikTok or Facebook or
Right.
whatever the platform is that you're promoting content on, you have to sort of manipulate that content to play by the rules of that platform. Like that's been the case online forever, right? And email marketing, same way, right? You have to sort of build a catchy enough subject
The
line
point
and a
here,
catchy
though,
enough snippet that people open the email. Like, that has been the case since the internet started.
for sure. But the point here, though, is that Google has shaped the entire internet. That's the sort of the meta point that she's making, is that Google is so dominant now that it is reshaping the entire internet in its own, according to its own rules. Um, there's a bunch of other points that she makes.
Which in most cases are actually in a user's best interest. I can't believe I'm
In
defending
some,
Google. We should definitely
well,
flag
so
this in our YouTube archives.
so what's interesting is that you're right, that essentially what Google, the helpful content update and its algorithm updates that are trying to fight spam, et cetera, that's all for the benefit of users. But there's a
Pages
way in
should
which
load
it's
quickly. We're not going to index
yes,
flash. Like, all of these, a lot of these updates that Google has made are very much in my best interest as a internet consumer.
absolutely. But there's another way in which it's all self-serving for Google, right? So AMP is a good case in point. So
Which
AMP
they've
was
effectively killed. Yeah.
right, but AMP was an effort. So Google, I mean, we're sort of going on about this and we should move on, but Google was trying to compete with apps for a very long time, fearing its own substitution by apps, which was Steve Jobs' vision, right? You don't need Google anymore because you've got these apps. And Google saw that as a kind of existential threat. And one of its responses to that was to create AMP. We need to speed up the entire web so that the mobile web experience is better, so that people will use the mobile web and use us to find stuff on the mobile web and don't have to rely on apps. So by speeding up the web, yes, they created a better user experience in some respects, but it was entirely self-serving, and AMP was a cluster for publishers and ultimately bad for users because you get these weird URLs and it just, I don't know. I mean, I'm not technical, so I can't tell you all the back end.
I'm not going to defend AMP. Not every decision that Google has made is good, but I mean, the fact that page speed now for sites that are actually generating views from Google, I'm sure page speed has come down by 75% since they launched that as a major, not even major, but as a significant ranking factor. So I think that I don't know. I just think that generally that the arc of what Google has pushed the internet towards is generally very good. And that if you think back to how awful the internet was in 2007 from a content consumption standpoint, especially on phones, like I think we're in a much better place now. So
that's for sure. That's for sure true. But as Google does these algorithm changes and rules changes and guideline changes, everybody follows, and it creates a kind of, to Mike's point about the feedback loop, for sure.
But that, again, that's true on every single platform. So yes, you can whine that Google is a monopoly. I certainly do as well. But to the extent that any platform has a significant set of eyeballs on it, you're going to be creating, you should be, if this is a business for you, you should be producing content that will perform according to those guidelines on any platform. And yes, maybe the problem is Google is too dominant. Totally agree. We need more competitors. But to sort of to put this particular problem of, homogeneity of experience and, writing content in a certain format at Google's feet, I think that's placing, placing blame that shouldn't exist, and certainly placing it at the wrong.
I think that
head.
It's the same discussion as, is the web getting crappier or is Google getting crappier, right? And Marissa Mayer's point, like Google really just reflects the web, but at the same time, Google shapes the web. So that there's some murky reality that we're living in where Google is doing things to benefit users. It's also acting in its own self-interest, and people are trying to game it. And so that brew of factors has resulted in some of the frustrations that people are experiencing. But let's move on to the third and final item today, which is a kind of hybrid of the Chat GPT store finally showing up, and this kind of, to lead us off, this new Rabbit virtual assistant hardware device that nobody saw coming, that has sold out in its kind of 10,000 preliminary pre-order run, which is kind of a surprise. And so these two things kind of have some common threads in an interesting way. One is kind of a new model opening up as an alternative to Google in the form of ChatGPT and the GPT store. And the other is a new device that promises, at least in theory, to radically simplify certain kinds of experiences. And there seems to be this is sort of all in the category of sort of alternatives to Google and appetites for alternatives.
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.